Here are the key points that we will go through in this presentation. The conditions-based theory came about because of the recognition that not all learning is the same. Compare, for instance, learning how to multiply with learning how to use the chopsticks. Acquiring these abilities, or learning outcomes, require the learner to go through a different cognitive process or internal condition. And because learning goes through a different cognitive process, different instructions or external conditions are needed. This is the basic premise of conditions-based theory. Gagne's theory of instruction was developed by Robert M. Gagne, who is widely recognized as the originator of the conditions-based theory. His theory consists of three components: a taxonomy of learning outcomes, or types of learning, the concept of learning hierarchies, and 9 events of instruction. We will look at each of these components in turn in the next few slides. Gagne categorized learning into 5 types. The first category is verbal information, which involves the ability to cite previously learned facts and concepts. The second is intellectual skills, which involves understanding how to carry out an action. This can range in complexity from being able to identify classes of objects that are similar, to actions involving higher-order thinking skills like generating a plan for a client. The third is cognitive strategies, which refer to the many ways by which learners guide their own learning and thinking. The fourth is attitudes, where actions are taken based on an internal state of understanding and feeling. An example will be choosing to stop using disposable bags because you care about the environment. And finally, the fifth category is motor skills, which is the ability to execute performances involving the use of muscles. An example will be performing CPR. The second concept in Gagne's theory is learning hierarchies. According to Gagne, a learning hierarchy is a set of intellectual skills having an ordered relationship to each other, from simple at the bottom to complex at the top. The diagram on the right shows that the 2 main tasks involved in the addition of integers can be further broken down into subordinate tasks, with the simplest task at the bottom of the diagram. The significance of this idea is that by identifying and mastering simpler prerequisite skills first, learning of more complex tasks can be facilitated. This has implications in task analysis, which is performed to identify prerequisite skills, as well as in determining the sequence of instruction, which usually proceeds from simple to complex. Gagne's theory also outlines 9 events that must occur to facilitate the internal processing of information that takes place during learning. The first is to gain the learner's attention. This can be achieved by using icebreaker activities or by asking thought-provoking questions. The second is to inform the learner of the objectives to help them understand what they are going to learn during the course. The third is to stimulate recall of prior learning by asking students about something they already know or have learned in a previous lesson. This process will help them make sense of the new information. The fourth is to present the stimulus or content by means of a video, lecture, podcast, or demonstration. The fifth is to provide learning guidance by advising them of the strategies, resources, or tools that can help them in their learning. The sixth is to elicit performance by asking learners to recall and elaborate on the new concepts they have learned. The seventh is for the teacher to provide feedback to students' performance. The eighth is to evaluate how well students have learned a topic by assessing their performance. The ninth is to enhance retention and transfer by helping students internalize the new knowledge. A number of scholars who came after Gagne further developed the conditions-based theory of instruction. One of them was Charles Rayluth, who developed the elaboration theory. According to his theory, instruction should be organized from simple to complex while providing a context for subsequent ideas and skills to be assimilated. The video in the link below uses Rayluth's zoom lens analogy to explain the elaboration theory. Click on the link to find out more. Gagne's theory of instruction consists of 5 categories of learning, with intellectual skills being ordered in a hierarchy. Each learning category requires a set of conditions for optimizing learning, retention, and transferability. These conditions may be internal or external. The external conditions, or instructional events that are required to stimulate the internal or cognitive process, are described in Garnier's 9 events of instruction. Through animal studies, behaviorism provided one of the earliest concrete evidence that different kinds of learning required different conditions. In the early days, Robert Garnier, too, was a behaviorist, but he became increasingly influenced by the information processing view of learning and memory. According to information processing theory, humans process the information they receive and do not simply just respond to stimuli. This idea led Garnier to identify the internal and external conditions that are required for learning to take place. Robert Garnier was an experimental psychologist who was concerned with learning and instruction. During World War II, he was working in the Air Force as an instructional psychologist, training pilots and other personnel. There, he was faced with the problem of determining what skills and knowledge are required for a person to become good at a specific job and how these requirements might be learned. This work proved to be an important factor in the development of his theory. Garnier published the first edition of his book, The Conditions of Learning, in 1965, but continued to refine his theory and published the fourth edition 20 years later. The first edition was largely behavioral, but has evolved to become one that is predominantly cognitive by the fourth edition. Garnier is generally regarded as the father of instructional design. One of his greatest contributions is in the field of instructional design that seeks to derive principles of instruction from existing learning theory. Educators widely agree that we cannot teach all content the same way. Teaching students how to solve problems or use concepts is different from teaching information. This follows directly from Garnier's taxonomy of learning. Through his learning hierarchies, we also understand that successful instruction begins with teaching lower-order skills and progressing upwards. Many educators also develop their teaching plans around Garnier's 9 instructional events. They start lessons by gaining the learner's attention, informing them of the objectives, before continuing through practice and assessment. Here is an example of Garnier's 9 instructional events being used to teach students about genetics.